Okay, we should get started. The topic for this panel is whistleblowers and what really goes on in banks. Stephanie GIBAUD will talk later about whistleblowing generally, her experiences with UBS, and I'm going to talk about a specific fraud right now and whistleblowing experience, which is there's a difference between our situations where she's going to discuss something which has already been in the media and which most of you would be familiar with, whereas I'm going to discuss something which is still currently being covered up and is not in the media. So there's been some talk already at the conference about banks in Latvia and about how quite often when there are fraud cases and money laundering cases and investigators are looking for where the money went, these are shell company accounts at banks licensed in Latvia where the money seems to be getting lost. My experience was as the Western rep for the largest of these banks in Latvia, which is no longer now, but it was called Parex Bank. And the saga also involves two institutions that all of us fund with our taxpayer money, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and Eurostat. To quickly sum up, and then I'll go into the details, the story is how the corrupt government of an impoverished country gave a quarter of the national budget to an oligarch's offshore bank and co-conspired with the EBRD and Eurostat to cover up the loss and blame the economic and demographic collapse on Sweden. And this is not an exaggeration. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, it's funded by taxpayers from 64 countries. Headquarters is in London, although it has legal immunity in the UK, and it has 3,000 employees. Eurostat is a directorate of the European Commission, and its responsibility is integrity of statistics, and it's headquartered in Luxembourg. A bit of background on Latvia. When you read in the newspaper about Latvia, it tends to be portrayed in an opposite way to Russia. It tends to be that Latvia is the friend of the West. It's on the same side with the United States and the European Union. It's a member of the European Union. It's a member of NATO as well. But there are lingering connections to Russia, which seem to be forgotten by the Western journalists most often. But in these banking scandals, they really make us question what side the Latvian government is really on. This organization, if you want to call it that, the Latvian proxy network, where Parex was the largest one, and some of the other banks have been mentioned in the other talks today and yesterday at this conference, is this network of banks and insurance companies and company formation agents, which the people in Latvia, people in the business community in Latvia say is the successor to the KGB in Latvia. That the people who used to be the KGB in Latvia, when the KGB was no longer, essentially became the bankers and lawyers who make up the Latvian proxy network. And some of the biggest frauds that also have been mentioned during this conference, like Magnitsky and the looting of Ukraine, and the 3 banks in Moldova where $1 billion disappeared. All of it is through this same system of banks. It tends to be not just one bank does one of the transactions. It tends to be that the banks split up the transactions between each other, so normally 3 or 4 banks will be involved, but they're all from the same family of banks. The history goes back to the KGB, with Grigory Luchansky was the one credited for kicking this off. And then a bit of numbers about how Latvia technically is with NATO. It spends something on defense of NATO, but it spends much more bailing out its oligarchs, and the oligarchs are more on the other side. I don't know if anybody recognizes this picture. This is a picture of the bosses of the Tambovskaya mafia in Spain, in Mallorca, I believe. Oh, we're not. Oh, this is not advancing. The slides are going to be available on should be available on the conference website later. These are the bosses of the Tambovskaya Mafia, which was the mafia in St. Petersburg at the time that Vladimir Putin was in St. Petersburg, who later relocated to Spain, where Spain actually had a large investigation into this, including some things that made the newspapers, like some of the witnesses getting assassinated. But Parex Bank was, in fact, connected to this group. That one of the wives of one of the bosses ran the European rep office for Parex Bank. The specialty of Parex Bank were shell company deposits, mostly denominated in dollars, that were mostly generated from the Russian and Ukrainian rep offices. And then there was an oligarch in Latvia who's regarded as the top oligarch in Latvia ever since independence more than 20 years ago. His name is Valery Kargin, and at the time that I lived in Latvia, the United States Embassy had banned Valery Kargin from visiting the embassy or meeting the ambassador, and the American Chamber of Commerce had banned Parex from membership. So now we come to where there's a Western front legitimizing the activities of this Russian offshore bank. These are some of the companies that I've come up against over this past 10 years. The beginning of it was getting recruited to be the Western rep for Parex. So I was in Latvia, and through business meetings, business networking in Latvia, I got recruited to be the Western front myself for this bank. I had heard all the rumors that this bank was the mafia, is essentially what people would say. However, the people who recruited me into the bank said this is not the correct message. They said we have transparency, we have proper corporate governance, our annual reports are signed by Ernst & Young. Fitch and Moody's both rate the bank. And we also had this anti-money laundering audit from Deloitte, which we successfully passed. So really my typical meeting was to meet with representatives of a foreign bank where we wanted to have a trading relationship or a correspondent account relationship. And they would ask me if the rumor was true that we were the mafia. And I would say, no, we're backed by all these respectable, we're backed by all these respectable organizations. And yeah, we have proper corporate governance, and there's no reason to worry about having accounts with us. So that's when, the last slide was about the Western front for the bank to try to make the bank legitimate, but now is about the truth behind the Western front and what was really going on with these companies. The clean AML audit by Deloitte, the people in the bank were telling me at the same time we got this audit that the core activity of the bank was money laundering. About the ratings agencies, I attended meetings with the ratings agencies, with Moody's and Fitch, where bank managers admitted to major frauds within the bank or major lapses of corporate governance, where the ratings agency people essentially pretended not to hear and took no action. I became concerned about learning about more and more loans, where the bank was increasingly making loans to secret-related parties and booking them as loans to third parties, to the extent that, in fact, the bank, if you subtracted these out, didn't even have any equity or had negative equity. That started a whistleblowing process, first with Ernst & Young, who their reaction was to do nothing. Secondly, to Latvian authorities, and not only to the general prosecutor, who I actually knew because he was the legal aide to Valery Kargin. I mean, I had meetings together with the general prosecutor, but also to other departments within the Latvian government, hoping I could find at least one department that was not allied together with the oligarch. That had no reaction. Getting warnings from former colleagues, I left the country, and that was 10 years ago. And then went on this saga of informing regulators in the UK, Sweden, Germany, and Switzerland, where Parex had operations in all of those countries and nobody did anything. There was one government that finally did something, which was the United States. This is about a headline from 2010 about the large settlement that the United States got from Daimler. The FBI did interview me a few times, making them, again, the only government that took any interest in the case at all. The FBI did get a large settlement from Daimler, and part of that was about bribes that went through Parex Bank to politicians. Also, it had a link to one of the frauds from my whistleblowing, because one of the frauds from my whistleblowing was about the loan that included the kickback money, where the loan had been falsely reported on the bank's financial statements because it exceeded the limits of the bank. And it's a really easy one to prove as well. I mean, this is something about these frauds is, I know with these money laundering cases, it can be very difficult when they have money running through webs of shell companies. It's hard to prove. But this was something that was extremely easy to prove. And not only extremely easy, just the fraud aspect of it, but the fact that the United States completed a case and handed a case to Latvia, and then Latvia decided to do absolutely nothing and let the statute of limitations run out. To me, this was like a wake-up call to Brussels to say, listen, law enforcement in Latvia is not functioning. I mean, they currently recognize Latvia to have a compliant Justice Department and rule of law with the European Union. But in this case, where there's a completed case, and it's a no-brainer that Latvia could collect big damages from Daimler, and yet they refuse to do anything except sit and wait for the statute of limitations to run out, it was quite revealing. The next one. Yeah, that's the end of the first one. So now we come to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and their beautiful webpage, where they talk all about integrity and transparency. One of the things here is the project complaint mechanism, which is where if you're a whistleblower, they have this thing that they boast about on their website, where you send a message to the project complaint mechanism and they reply back to you. It's been years since I've sent information to them and they have never replied back about anything. And there's also, this will come up later, is they talk about the principle of supporting multi-party democracy. That's supposed to be one of their functions, is promoting multi-party democracy. So the bailout, this is 4 years after my whistleblowing, and the bank has borrowed much more money by that now. Suddenly, after 10 years of reporting profits and having Ernst & Young sign off on this, the government made a transfer of approximately 2 billion euros, which is a quarter of the national budget in Latvia, to the bank, and announced that the bank had been nationalized, the equity had been nationalized for a penny. And this announcement came out of nowhere because the bank had always been reporting profits up till then. There was no clue that there was any kind of a problem at the bank. Latvia immediately got downgraded, and there were worries, I suppose, from the ratings agencies that the 2 billion euros was not really a loan and that this money was in fact lost and should be written off. However, then the EBRD arrived, and the EBRD announced that they did a thorough due diligence on the assets of the bank, and the bank was valuable, and that they were going to pay 100 million euros to buy an equity stake in the bank from the government. And there was an IMF bailout involved with this as well to replace the 2 billion that the country had transferred to the bank. At this point, I had no idea what to think. I was in exile already, and I knew that the bank's financial statements were not truthful. But at the same time, the EBRD was announcing that they did this due diligence and that everything was okay. The truth started to come out a year later in 2010 when the government announced this split into a good bank and a bad bank, and at the same time admitted that, in fact, 50% of the assets of the bank were bad and would go to the bad bank. They also came up with specific examples, some of which were the same ones from my whistleblowing from years earlier. The one implication was that the profits from the bank had not been real for the entire 10 years. Another implication was that that things that were being booked as loans seemed not really to be loans and seemed more like payoffs or embezzlement. There was one example that the media came up with, which I did not know about, which was a transfer of 100 million euros to a Russian oligarch with no collateral. In the case where this was now a government asset, the government was owed this 100 million euros, and the oligarch essentially said he's not going to pay it back, and there was no way for the government to collect it back. It's an example of something that probably was not actually a loan, probably was a payoff to somebody. The media was not writing articles about this. Then is when this hint about how the EBRD purchase of the shares was in fact fraudulent, was that a website leaked a report by Nomura indicating that 5 years in the future, that Latvia was secretly obligated to reverse the purchase where the EBRD had supposedly bought a quarter of the bank's stock. So this was obvious fraud to me, and I started contacting journalists and found a very difficult time finding journalists who would publish articles that contradicted what the Latvian government was saying and what the EBRD was saying. I did find a few who I'll name at the end, who are the few journalists I found who really got into this story, and both of them published several articles. But overall, the media was still about how the global crisis had hurt Latvia and the EBRD had rescued Latvia, and nothing about embezzlement of the assets of a bank. And then my nemesis from all of this became the Prime Minister of Latvia, who was the same one who signed the agreement with the EBRD, who went on an international speaking tour telling international audiences about how Sweden had caused the crisis in Latvia. And this is no exaggeration. I went to one of these events myself. I was at an event in Monaco 2 years ago where the Prime Minister of Latvia was there. The organizer of the event knew me, and he told me at the beginning that he doesn't want me to ask any embarrassing questions to the Prime Minister and ruin his conference. But the Prime Minister honestly stood up there in front of the audience, talked about how his austerity program was so wonderful and about how everything was fixed in Latvia, and talked about how the crisis had been caused by a bubble that had been caused by Sweden. The last one, please. That's the Prime Minister of Latvia signing the deal. And I put next to it because I want this in the presentation in case this gets sent around to any journalist, and I hope people write this up. Something which has been going on since the discovery that this sale was a fake sale because it was secretly reversible is the question of whether this really is a fraud or not. A lot of journalists are not accountants, and they don't necessarily know that it is a fraud. And therefore, I like to point out that many other famous frauds were the same way. This is perhaps the most famous example of the same kind of fraud. This is about Enron. And in this Enron fraud, essentially Enron wanted to make their annual results look better than they really were and entered a conspiracy with Merrill Lynch whereby they sold an Enron asset to Merrill Lynch at a fictitious inflated price to make it look like Enron was doing really well. But they didn't reveal that there was a secret agreement, side agreement, that Enron would buy back the asset after some years from Merrill Lynch with a guaranteed profit. In that case, in the Enron deal, one Enron executive and 4 Merrill Lynch executives were sentenced to prison. So anyway, I was still looking for people in Europe who were interested in doing something about this. I finally found somebody who was a member of parliament in the Netherlands who came across me online while he was doing research about the Magnitsky case. He became horrified that a bank that had been part of the network that had been involved in the money laundering in the Magnitsky case appeared to be getting protection or getting bailed out with European tax money and getting bailed out in a fraudulent way. So I met with him. I went to Amsterdam and I met with him, and he wrote a letter to Eurostat. Finally, I had somebody who had authority to ask questions and actually get answers to his questions. And he wrote to Eurostat that Latvia had falsified its financial statements in 2009 to cover up the truth about this bank collapse, and had done so with this fake purchase-repurchase agreement with the EBRD, and asking Eurostat to please force Latvia to restate its financial statements. Of course, this would be very embarrassing to Eurostat because it implies that Latvia entered the Eurozone, entered the euro currency with fraudulent financial statements. And the people at Eurostat made the reply again. I mean, I've again and again been really horrified by the behavior of the different organizations, which I've gone step by step through. But the people at Eurostat replied that the EBRD actually asked them in the beginning when they designed the cover-up fraud for permission to carry out this fraud, and Eurostat, in fact, approved the fraud. Remember that the reason why we pay taxes to support Eurostat is because they're supposed to ensure the integrity of the national financial statements, and it seemed what they were actually doing was exactly the opposite. So by now, the reversal of the purchase has already been carried out. It was carried out at the end of 2014. Another detail that came up is apparently the fraud between the Latvian government and the EBRD was done between one particular political party in Latvia and the EBRD at the exclusion of the opposition political party. And the timing of the fraud was such that it exactly got them past re-election before the revealing of the cover-up that had kept this corrupt, or allowed this corrupt political party to win election even after they had done this. So the EBRD, again, remember, with a charter that they are supposed to be supporting multi-party democracy, in Latvia sided with one particular political party to help them fraudulently win an election against another political party that was not knowledgeable of the cover-up. This, again, it's not an exaggeration. I mean, it seems outrageous, the whole Sweden thing, but it is true that I get feedback from people who are businessmen in Latvia, and I ask them if anybody in Latvia really believes this story, that actually Sweden was the country that was responsible for the crash of the national economy. And I understand that quite a few mainstream voters actually do believe this story, and I've had debates on Facebook with people where I saw somebody put a comment on a Facebook post about Latvian politics, about anger directed at Sweden about the collapse of the Latvian economy. And I find that there is some part of the population has really been duped by this and really has been convinced that the Russian mafia had nothing to do with this, and somehow Sweden caused the country to collapse. And also that it wasn't the fault of the government that the economy collapsed, but rather that the government rescued them from a collapse that was caused from outside. So all of this still continues now, and the updates, some of these subjects were already talked about at this conference. The Latvian offshore banks are still thriving, and money is still disappearing from banks in Ukraine and Moldova and Russia. The EBRD has learned nothing from this, or I suppose they didn't get punished for this, so they are continuing to do the same thing that they were doing before. For example, a whistleblower from Lithuania informed me that they did the same thing for Ukio Bank in Lithuania after they did this for Parex Bank in Latvia. Ukio Bank is another of the banks that also was involved in the Magnitsky money laundering. And this is not a joke, but Prime Minister Dombrovskis is not the Prime Minister of Latvia anymore. He is in fact vice president of the European Commission, responsible for the integrity of the euro. You can read about him in the Wall Street Journal because he's going to Greece, for example, to give advice to the Greeks about what they should do about their debt crisis. And presumably he's telling the same sorts of ideas he came up with in Latvia, where you don't actually solve the debt crisis, but you make some kind of fake transaction to hide the debt. The call to action, and what I really would love to see at the end of this conference, is some journalists contacting the EBRD and asking them if they can confirm or deny that they did what I have just outlined. The evidence is clear. I mean, in 2009, they announced that they bought this quarter stake in this nationalized bank on the basis of it being valuable. And then in 2010, we learned that it was not valuable. And then in 2014, Latvia bought back the stake at a guaranteed profit to the EBRD. So the whole chain of the fraud has already passed by and gone and already been confirmed. But at the same time, the EBRD is silent about it, and the media has also been silent about it. So this is where I would hope to have some follow-up where people ask the EBRD about it, and not me because they won't talk to me. But any articles are greatly appreciated about this. I really think they should be exposed, and I think they've been doing this in a lot of other countries as well. And I really think that this would be the path to do something about this Latvian proxy network, which has caused so much grief in so many countries, including Latvia and including here as well, is that perhaps hoping that that Latvian authorities are ever going to prosecute anybody, maybe that's a hopeless dream. But certainly I believe that the Western media should be able to expose the EBRD and ask some tough questions to Eurostat as well, and to get the truth of this out, like a confession that Sweden had nothing to do with the crash of the Latvian economy, and that the bailout of Parex Bank was designed in such a way to purposefully hide the truth of what really happened from the voters. For further information, details on anything, including any backup evidence of anything that I said, there's a website, Lawless Latvia, and it's also on Facebook and Twitter. The journalists who are the two journalists who are really champions in all of this were Mauro Catarina from Italy and Arno Wellens from the Netherlands. Mauro was first to seize on this, where he just sensed that all the news that was coming out about Latvia, about the crisis, was absolutely not true. And he was on the ground in Latvia and was really shocked by what was going on. He made a real effort to get stories into the Italian media. And then Arno Wellens made a big effort to get the story into the Dutch media a year or two after, and even went as far as talking to members of parliament in the Netherlands to try to get people interested at a parliamentary level, which is how I found my backer in the Dutch parliament. But anyway, there were about 100 journalists who let me down and wouldn't publish anything about the fraud. But these two guys are the two who really were tenacious and called up the EBRD, heard the lies or insults from the EBRD, but then went with the evidence instead and published the real story. Yeah, I wasn't advancing the slides all the time, but anyway, they should all be on the conference website afterward. And now Stephanie is welcome to talk about more the general problems that whistleblowers face, and then there can be a Q&A also.
Thank you, John. My presentation is going to be extremely different for two reasons. The first one is that I used to work for UBS, and the UBS case is famous all over the world. And the second reason is that everyone talks about whistleblowing, about hidden information, about corruption, about big money. But being a whistleblower is the price we pay to tell the truth. John was explaining that he lives in exile, And I will tell you my story, and I will tell you what we are trying to do to protect whistleblowers. I live in France, the country of human rights, who doesn't protect whistleblowers, nor does Europe, nor does Brussels. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm lucky enough to still be alive and to be able to share my experience with you today, and thus focus on the human part. The problem is not when one blows the whistle. The problem is what our lives turns out to be afterwards. So I was not meant to be a whistleblower. I was the head of marketing and communication at UBS France, and most of my budgets and my time were devoted to the organization of VIP events for clients and partnerships with luxury brands to organize cross-selling events. And in June 2008, the office of the general manager was searched, and I was asked by my manager to delete the content of 1,000 Excel files, which were Excel sheets listing the clients and the prospects of the banks linked to client advisors, either in France, but also in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Monaco, Belgium, or other places. As I was busy, I didn't pay attention to the instruction. However, my manager came back and asked me to delete also the content of my archives, paper archives relating to the events. And that these requests sounded quite weird. I started asking questions, which led to answers which most of you now know. Swiss client advisors never had been allowed to work in France and sell offshore products. UBS had organized tax evasion and money laundering all over the world. As you might know, they were about to lose their license in the United States in 2009 for the same illegal activities, with my ex-colleague Bradley Birkenfeld going to jail for that. So what it is to be a whistleblower, in my case, it's been harassment by my management, not allowed to leave the office anymore, not allowed to visit the clients and the partners anymore, discriminated in terms of salary, bonuses, promotion. I was then given another job. I turned out to be the head receptionist at the bank. I was very pleased to do so. UBS tried to fire me in 2009, but it was refused by the inspector of work, because in France we are somehow protected. And then I turned out to be the assistant of a young woman who'd been given my job. And the main quality she had is that her parents were clients of the bank in Geneva. And then I was isolated with instruction not to talk to me anymore. I was not invited to the meetings. I was not sent any emails. I turned out to be totally transparent. The management sent emails to the whole bank, to all the people at the bank, explaining that I was inventing stories, that I was a liar, and that obviously UBS complies with the rules in each of the country where the bank operates. In 2010, the bank filled in a complaint against me for defamation. They lost. And it's not over, because in 2011, I understood from a journalist who works very close to French services that I was being followed and listened to by the DCRI, which is the French services. And when I was made redundant in 2012, I was almost dead. And then I thought that I would find another job and that my life would go back to normal, but then started another story, because the UBS case in France started to be public with the indictment of the bank. Therefore, UBS started to discredit me in the media. Obviously, they focused on the messenger and not on the message. You transform the truth in lie and the lies in the lie in truth, and that's just it. So, as of 2011, I was contacted by the French customs, and I started helping the French civil servants to understand and to access the information they would never have been able to get without my help. So to make a long story short, as a whistleblower, you lose everything, including your health, your energy, your job, your career, your friend, your life. You pay the price to be honest, and you are just a witness of a crime. If information we reveal as an insider had not been hidden, we were able to prove to all the civil servants the origin and the purpose of the information. We do that with conscience. We do that because we are citizens. The purpose of secrecy, as you know, is to hide information from the general interest. However, with banks, people do not understand. For example, there's a famous whistleblower in France, and her name is Irène Frachon. She's a doctor, and she explained that pills killed people. There are 2,000 people who died because of the medication she blew the whistle on. So everyone understands 2,000 people means something. When you talk about billions, somehow people do not understand. So as far as I know, when I blew the whistle as an executive in 2008, first, like many whistleblowers, I was expecting UBS to congratulate me for my discovery and that things would go back to normal. However, after going through what we know that, companies just want us to be squashed like insects. They attack our personalities, our dignity, our honor, then never discuss the message. So obviously we have to collect all the information by ourselves. And it's very complicated because the banks are so powerful because it's not available inside the bank. We all are compartmented. We do not know what the real core business is. And at UBS, what we understood is that only the top manager were aware of the situation. The managers, they repeat that they comply with the rules. However, they are indicted today for tax, fraud, and money laundering. So they definitely were aware of the illegal activities because the bonuses of the bankers were distributed according to the net new money and the number of opening accounts on an international scale. We also discovered that the bank managers were covering a double accounting to pay the bonuses of these bankers. I'm often being asked how things could have been better. This is really complicated because, first of all, we are extremely isolated. As far as I'm concerned, I filled in a complaint in France in 2008 against the bank. And unfortunately, the legal procedures are awfully long. Justice is definitely not adapted in my country, at least. One, what we understand is that one prefers protecting companies and information rather than protecting citizens. However, if I had not talked, who would have? If John hadn't talked, who would know about that story? So things could be a little bit easier if obviously the executives of the companies were doing their jobs properly instead of closing their eyes for bonus purposes. If the regulations had also done their jobs properly, and if justice was tougher with the guilty ones than with us, because they don't go to jail. The prison sentences are for the whistleblowers, they are not for the guilty ones. So for us, it's double punishment. Not only you are faithful and you have the courage to stand up, not only does your country recover lots of hidden assets they would never have recovered if you had not been around, and we have absolutely nothing to protect us laws are non-existent, and our lives turn out to be gloomy because obviously we feel disdain, not only from the banking world, but from everyone. So, to make a long story short, if people were doing their jobs properly, this would not happen. You know, in France, for example, you never hear the word corruption. Corruption is for South America, corruption is for Asia. You would never hear the word corruption in French. You forget it. However, you have complicity at the highest level. First of all, with politicians. You know, in France, with the UBS case, we had, I don't know if you've heard about that, about the Cahuzac story and the Bettencourt story. Mr. Cahuzac was the finance minister, the one telling us he was running against tax evasion, and he's the one who had a hidden account at UBS in Geneva. Yes, it's true. You said no, but I can tell you it's true. And with the Bettencourt story as well, with Mrs. Bettencourt, is the heiress of L'Oréal. She's the richest lady in our country, and her offshore accounts at UBS would have supported Mr. Sarkozy's presidential campaign in 2007. And you remember that when Mr. Sarkozy was the president, he was saying that tax paradises were coming to an end. And then we had another finance minister called Mr. Moscovici, who now has a very important job in Brussels. And he removed Jersey and the Bermudas from the blacklist of tax paradises. What happens in France with UBS happens all over the world. For example, in the United States, I was in Washington, D.C. on the 4th of September last year, which is Labor Day, and President Obama flew his helicopter to go and play golf with the president of UBS, because UBS was the biggest donor for his second presidential campaign. Now we can hear, I guess it's the Financial Times or the New York Times, that just put the emphasis on Mrs. Hillary Clinton's foundation, the biggest the biggest donator since 2009 is UBS. Do not forget that in 2009 she's the one who signed the agreement with Switzerland, and UBS had to give the names of 4,450 American clients which were cheating the IRS thanks to the services of the bank. But who were those 4,450 people? Were they top politicians? We had our number 3 at UBS, Mr. Raoul Weil, extradited to the US. And last year, he was found not guilty by this court in Florida. However, the court in Florida never was willing to listen to my testimony, nor was it willing to listen to my ex-colleague Brad Birkenfeld. Because we all know that Mr. Weil was the head of the PEP desk, the Personality Exposed People in Switzerland. Now he's indicted in France, but we'll see what happens. Next. Then after the politicians, the regulators. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mark Branson. He is the one who pleaded guilty in front of the US Justice for UBS in 2009. Now Mr. Branson heads the FINMA, the Swiss regulators. In France, Pierre Moscovici, who was the Minister of Finance, he named my head of compliance of UBS France to the Commission of Sanctions at the French market authorities. Third problem, after the politicians and the regulators, justice. Justice is extremely slow. There's a lack of financial means, and the magistrates, at least in France, they prefer to protect their careers more than fighting for truth and honesty. Then there's the impunity of those who implement and allow the system to work. Hence, the duplicity of some of our governments. and the silence of our administration. This is why there's a lack of law to protect whistleblowers. Each time I meet a deputy in France, I am being said the same, but you know, it's so complicated. However, it's not complicated to pass laws such as the Patriot Act in the US, or like in France, where the deputies just passed the law of mass surveillance. 450 out of 500 deputies voted for that. So my story is an example, but I'm sure that you've heard the cases of Rudi Elmer in Switzerland. He was the head of Julius Baer in the Cayman, the one of Hervé Felciani, HSBC, the one of Lutz Hotter, this German guy who also went to jail. So all of them have been to prison. All of them have lost their jobs. All of them have, broken the bank secrecy in Switzerland. However, the first one who had broken the bank secrecy was my ex-employer. It was UBS. So being a whistleblower is a human fight versus hidden information. It's a question of moral values versus money. It's a question of behavior versus wrongdoings. It's a question of citizens versus powerful lobbyings. Whatever the stories are, they are absolutely incredible. I'm sure you've heard of Antoine Deltour and the LuxLeaks story more recently. It happened to be published in November last year. So as whistleblowers, we just like more equality, more justice, and more equal rights when facing the justice. The problem is that banks are 5 steps ahead of the law. Politicians, authorities, and bankers have to divorce. Their relationship is absolutely insane. We, whistleblowers, point the failure of our politicians, the crisis of our democracies, and the representability. We have no other desire but to help the general interest. In France, UBS is indicted 4 times. They had to pay a deposit of 1.1 billion euros last year to the French justice. It's the biggest ever. UBS is appealing its case to the European Court of Human Rights. How can it be possible that they can appeal the case and don't even protect whistleblowers? In terms of figures, for example, we know, thanks to the German authorities who have helped the French ones, that 15 to 19 billion euros belonging to French citizens would lay in the UBS Geneva bank accounts. I know what UBS has done to my country. UBS has done the same to all the countries in Europe, to name a few: Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Belgium, where UBS is under investigation, Germany as well. UBS paid a 300 million fine last year to Germany. Mr. Juncker is still heading Europe, although we whistleblowers have been received by the Special Tax Ruling Commission following the LuxLeaks and the SwissLeaks stories. So, as I traveled to each European countries and spread the word that definitely whistleblowers have to be protected, we are trying to set up a network of whistleblowers because all of us feel isolation. We had a word before studying the meeting here today, and obviously we feel so isolated. So we have the know-how, we have the knowledge, we are the insiders. We stand up for the interest of all and for the common good. As we are here in London, I can just quote Mrs. Margaret Hodge, who had interviewed CEOs of multinational companies last year about tax dodging and tax avoidance. It's not a question whether it could be legal in some countries. Now, it's a question of morality for a better world. Thank you very much. Would you like to come here? Would you like to have questions to John or to myself?
You can answer questions to either of us or both of us. Anything about whistleblowers or about UBS or about Parex? I'm remembering one funny detail about the Parex thing that I did not include in the slides, is that Eurostat, in the process of helping Latvia to falsify its financial statements to enter the Eurozone after transferring a quarter of the budget to a Russian offshore bank, guess who is the main purchaser of the bonds that have been issued by Latvia? The European Central Bank. So essentially, Eurostat helped Latvia to fraudulently sell bonds to the European Central Bank. And this is the sort of thing that's going on with the bureaucrats who are, running our bank systems. Yep.
What you're talking about this mass laundering of Russian money through the Latvian banking system, it's very similar to what we heard yesterday about laundering money through the Moldovan banking system. Do you think this is just generally going on in Eastern Europe and we don't know about it?
There are links between what's been going on in Moldova and in Latvia, like, for example, money run through Latvian bank accounts involving court judgments that were apparently bought from judges in Moldova. There are certain personalities who are involved in both places. One person is the head of the Russian railways, Mr. Yakunin, who is sanctioned by some countries. He was connected with banks in Latvia and in Moldova. There also was a common oligarch who was involved in the banks in both countries named Vladimir Antonov, who was involved in Latvia and Lithuania and Moldova. There were other sorts of connections between the shell company providers, the banks. It seems that there is a network that somehow is connected with the Kremlin and somehow is running the banks in Moldova and in Latvia. Ewan?
Yeah. Before a quick question, one to each of you. I would just add in relation to the Moldovan presentation yesterday and Oliver's question and your answer that I don't think it's a coincidence that Riga was and is a favoured retirement location for ex-Soviet military, particularly Navy, and that the same applies to Odessa, which is of course just across the border from Moldova. The direct and indirect tax evasion in relation to imports and exports, Moldova, Romania, Transnistria, Ukraine, as often as not, the money will go through Latvia in and out, and that has been essentially unhindered for many years. So it's the same, I can assure you, it's the same scenario. Quick question for John. In relation to the Tambov group, do you have any plans to raise the issue again when, and it's probably only a month or two away now, the UK publishes the inquiry into the murder of Alexander Litvinenko? Given the testimony that was made there about Tambov group links in the 1990s, which you referred to in Petersburg, particularly in the context of Alexander Litvinenko's work with Spanish law enforcement through the UK just before he died. I think that might be a useful opportunity to raise how all this is linked.
Yeah, well, throughout this, I mean, it's 10 years it's been for me, and I don't have any organization, and if I come to an event, I just come by myself, and about like raising issues with different governments, it's not such an easy thing for me to do. more what I do is if I happen to meet a journalist who's interested in the area, I ask him to please publish a story, and then I hope someone picks up on this, because I'm not a regulator and I'm not getting paid for this, and for me to be petitioning governments about things is not very convenient. But no, I think that governments absolutely have dropped the ball on this. I mean, Spain did something. Spain at least didn't cover up everything and rather had some kind of investigation and even issued arrest warrants for a couple of the top people. Yeah, but this, I mean, I think it does go beyond financial fraud and just greedy people who want money. I mean, I think there's a way to look at this, what's going on in Latvia and Ukraine and Moldova, as even expansionist plans militarily by the Putin regime, and that perhaps it's done in coordination with the Kremlin to purposefully destroy democracy in these countries to soften them up. And then when you think of it in those terms, and then you think about how Eurostat and the EBRD are covering up for them and protecting them, it becomes truly outrageous.
You might not be exaggerating there, I have to say. You might not at all. Regarding UPS, somewhat similar question. Is there any opportunity, given the FIFA scandals, to maybe link with people who are working or worked within FIFA? Because I wouldn't be surprised if UBS carries featured rather prominently in the FIFA payments, Platini, Warner, and the like. So maybe you could work together with the Sunday Times and the like on that.
I think that what could be interesting is that if we could be linked, if we could be in contact with the whistleblowers at the FIFA. So if there are journalists here, I would love to. I used to work in a football club before working with UBS. So I know the world of football quite well as well. And Credit Suisse and UBS had to come and answer questions being asked to them quite recently. It was last month, I think, to the investigators in Switzerland. However, we know that what's in Switzerland will be buried in Switzerland. So it's like what happened with France. We have to take the story out of the country for the investigation to move on. Does it answer your question?
I think that certainly does. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the Paul Erdman books from the late 1970s, and he, for those who are maybe not familiar with, he's now dead. He was a Canadian banker who was jailed or he was detained in Switzerland for a fraud that became the subject of a film with Michael Caine. And all his books, very, very funny books, they're all about banking, they're all about Switzerland, and one thing that comes out is you have to take it outside Switzerland for the reasons you've just mentioned. And boy, did Paul hate the Swiss.
If I could just say something, Rudolf Elmer, the head of the Julius Bank in the Cayman, is Swiss. He now lives in Switzerland. He's been going through a turmoil. So if any of you are journalists and want to talk to him, I would be very pleased to put you in contact. To contact me, it's easy. I have a website, which is stephaniegibaude.com. stephaniegibaude, no dot, in a word.com. Any other questions for John or for me?
The FIFA thing, I know that FIFA is going to be discussed later today at this conference. It's something that I would love to see some academic study someday in the future of how these sorts of corrupt organizations even get their start. How a multinational organization like the EBRD or like FIFA, year after year after year, with thousands of international employees, can do exactly the opposite of what they're writing on their website, and yet it just perpetuates and keeps going. It's really amazing to me because it's not in my mentality, but it seems that this is how most people are.
They're frightened. They have their jobs and their families. They're frightened.
More questions? Yes?
Just a point about another Swiss bank that's recently featured in some frank whistleblower retaliation litigation. This particular individual sent a report to the SEC indicating that there had been a corrupt collusion between this bank plus some of its other clients regarding the manipulation of the exchange traded notes market. And he is now suing them, saying that their method of retaliation against him is what he calls gaslighting. So I have a question. It comes from some old black and white movie where some chap who wanted to leave his wife decided to convince her she was bombers so they locked him in an asylum. And he claims that the bank started to send him false information, wrong figures, wrong information, wrong numbers to make it easy for him to do his job. And then they suggested he should go to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist fed him very heavy doses of Larnectin and other types of antipsychotic medications. Sort of drove him mad. And meanwhile, their bank says that they sacked him because he was incompetent because he was mad. So it's like this kind of solidarity. You don't know who's the patient, who's the doctor, or what's actually going on. But it seems like a novel tactic.
Well, I'm sure that whistleblowers quite often feel like they're going to go crazy from all the backlash against them. I mean, I had this. I absolutely did not expect the reaction I got from all these people, from the auditors and the ratings agencies and the regulators and police in different countries. It was close to 100%, not quite 100%, but about 99% of the people I've encountered absolutely have this shoot the messenger thing and that, like, I'm crazy and I should shut up and I should stop bothering them and so forth. And it's really shocking, but no, I'm not surprised that this sort of thing happens.
The big difference, because our stories, you said yours started 10 years ago? When did
10 years ago,
10
yeah.
years ago. I blew the whistle in 2008, which is at the same time when the HSBC story was public and when Rudolf Elmer came back from the Cayman, etc. So now we start being several people all saying the same thing. So it's somehow easier for the new ones, let's say for Antoine Deltour with the LuckLeaks, to join us, because at least we have been here for a long time. But it's true, we all go through terrible phases. They make us turn totally crazy. And, well, you know, it's just our lives. But then we have parents, families, children, and everything goes away because obviously you have no job. As you may know, legal fees are awfully expensive. And we are being attacked. UBS has attacked me twice. I wrote a book which was published last year. They are attacking the book, so I have to defend myself all the time. And the only thing is that I haven't done anything wrong. I just said no to what they were doing. And this is where justice doesn't work at all. Because as long as you have the financial means to pay tons of very interesting international lawyers, they will network and they will make sure that, you know, it will take lots of time to move on. I am wondering what's going to happen to the case in France. Is the bank ever going to be judged? No one knows. We have the presidential elections in 16, 18 months, so it may help François Hollande, who had said, finance is my enemy. Well, we don't know, but it's really tough. Honestly, we pay a really high price.
It would be great, I think, from time to time, if I would be a philanthropist, if I would establish a cash reward for people with inside knowledge about what the Latvian banks and the Latvian government are doing, that, you know, anybody who gives useful information would win some kind of reward for this. Or within other organizations as well. Latvia has privatized 2 more companies that were both fraudulent oligarch-controlled companies that supposedly now have been privatized because Europe told them to privatize it. And now I'm wondering if all of those are fake transactions as well, where they used a front investor who isn't really an investor because they haven't really reformed that company, and where they're going to have reversions with the sales later. I would love to go to a company like Air Baltic and say, if anybody has the details of the privatization of Air Baltic and sends them to me, you know, I'll give you a cash reward for this, and then expose the whole thing. That would be great. Or in the EBRD, I think there must be people in those 3,000 people who work there who are against what they're doing. I mean, think about Swedish employees who work in the EBRD. So they're fraudulently helping to blame a Russian mafia fraud on Sweden. And if you were a Swedish employee at the EBRD, should you be very happy about that? I mean, there should be a way to, I would love to get a big message in front of all of those 3,000 people and say, listen, if anybody there is interested in telling the truth and going against your bosses, then there's some kind of reward for that. More questions? I think we could do one more, and I think that's the end then, but any more? You can say a final word if you want to.
Well, a final word. I don't know. What comes to my brain right now is that my ex-colleague, Brad Birkenfeld, who is the one who blew the whistle in the US in 2007, he spent 30 months in jail. So this is the American justice. And at the same time, the IRS wrote a check of $104 million to him when he was set free.
That was his reward for whistleblowing.
It was his reward as a whistleblower. So I spent a week in Boston with him at his place, something like 2 years ago. And the other day on the phone, I said to him, you know, according to what my life is, it's been lasting for 7 years now. I am wondering whether it wouldn't have been better for me to go to jail and cash a check instead of being like somehow hijacked by this story, which doesn't come to an end. So, you know, you have two different, the story is the same, but you have two different ways to see it. So it's always the same. It's money versus our lives. I don't know what else to add. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, my last word is just that I would really love for more journalists to get interested in this story. There's not any kind of liability problem with putting these accusations in print. The guy did it in Italy in about 3 different newspapers. The other guy did it in the Netherlands in about 3 different newspapers. The EBRD never tried to put any sort of pressure on either of them to retract anything. I mean, the stories are backed up with clear evidence. The EBRD and the Latvian government co-conspired to fraudulently help Latvia to bail out this bank and get into the Eurozone. And this should absolutely be in more newspapers. And not only in Italian and Dutch, it should be in French and English as well. That's all.